Colorado's Gold Dome is bustling, and state lawmakers have already kicked off the annual legislative session.
For those who are being sworn in, would you please raise your right hand and repeat after me? I state your name. Do solemnly swear.
There are a lot of new lawmakers this year, especially in the House, where Republicans picked up a few seats. And that means a lot of getting to know yous going on.
I've met some of the Democrat legislators that I didn't know in the past, and I think I'm getting a good rapport with some of them.
Having worked as an aide, now being sitting in a seat, it feels surreal, and it's so exciting.
This is my third session. The other 2 times I was a staff member and then an aide before that. But just really excited to get to work. I'm focusing very heavily on public safety right now.
Democrats still maintain wide majorities in both the House and Senate, but they'll be navigating bills and debates under a very different national political environment with a new Trump administration.
A little bit nervous about our immigrant populations and the threats of deportation coming from Washington, the threats of using the military. We're still trying to figure out what might occur if that was to happen.
There's also all the interpersonal dynamics between lawmakers.
I think I'm excited about developing new relationships with my colleagues. I'm hoping that we can learn to disagree better and that we can continue to disagree over policy and not make it personal. I think that's what the people of Colorado expect us to do.
But, of course, disagreements are kind of our business here at Purplish. So let's see what's already brewing. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Capitol News Alliance, a podcast about Colorado politics, policy, and now the 2025 state legislative session. I'm Benta Birkeland.
And I'm Lucas Brady Woods.
The pomp and ceremony of the opening days at the Capitol are over. Lawmakers are starting to settle in for the next 4 months of work.
Things are still kind of quiet at the State House. Before they can really dive into debating bills, lawmakers spend these early days getting up to speed.
The committees are meeting, but it's mostly just getting updates from various state departments and other offices and from the public.
Which means we have a moment here to look back at the last few days and catch up on how the session started.
And we'll look forward to some of the big issues that are already on tap that we know will take up a lot of time and debate this session.
Before we get into the meaty stuff, let's talk opening day. How lawmakers choose to kick off the session can say a lot about how the rest of their time might go.
In a lot of ways, the opening day is kind of a reminder of how human all of the lawmakers are.
Yep.
And I don't want to say we don't think of them as humans, but it's just there's a lot of running around. And it's the one time in the whole year that the chamber is just so packed with pretty much everyone has a guest, family member or friend, and then guests in the galleries and people taking selfies.
A lot of kids.
Yeah, at one point they had, I think everyone who'd brought a child under the age of 12 or something said the Pledge of Allegiance, and they were all lined up on the House floor. It was really cute.
Really cute, to be honest. There was a lot of giddiness that was really palpable in the chamber. A lot of freshman lawmakers were there who just won elections, and some for the first time winning elections, and they're finally going to actually get to start their work.
But there were still some more serious moments in spite of all the ceremony and excitement. And at least one thing we saw in the House was a little intrusion, I would say, of D.C.-style politics.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the objections to certifying the election, which is usually such a dry moment, it's actually hard to even know what's happening.
The Secretary of State's office has delivered the certification of the abstract of votes cast in the general election.
I love covering the Capitol, but there's these certain procedural moments that, for the most part, people just completely tune out, and this will be one of them normally.
Is there any objection to the adoption of the report of the Committee on Credentials? Seeing objection, members, we are going to allow 5 minutes for discussion of any objection to the Credentials.
This delayed things a little bit on opening day.
Representative DeGraff.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
DeGraff went into some detail on what he thought were security issues in our voting system.
So what we have is a system that we've referred to as the gold standard, and then we say it only substantially meets those requirements. We're not told which requirements that are not met.
And then Democrats had a chance to rebut that.
It is my belief that opposition to this motion is, quite frankly, dangerous to our democracy. We've seen what happened when Congress went down.
But really, in the end, only 6 Republicans voted against certifying the election. And to be clear, the vast majority, along with all Democrats, voted to certify it. So the election results were never in jeopardy, and in the end, this really was just political theater, but unexpected, and something we really haven't seen before in recent years.
There was one other significant change that I haven't really seen before. Almost in all my years at the State House, electing the Speaker has been a unanimous thing. Everyone just agreed to whoever the majority caucus picked. And I actually talked to a member about this to make sure, am I remembering this right?
So my first 2 terms, it was just via voice. We voted for the Speaker as a chamber, just yelling out. And, it was just one vote.
So that's Republican Matt Soper, and he confirmed my memory is somewhat still intact, that, it was just a voice vote. And what's interesting is last session, he actually objected when a couple of the more conservative members of that caucus said they wouldn't vote for a Democratic speaker.
Bottoms nominated Rep. DeGraff, and I rose and spoke out against that. And I said, this is not proper. We have a tradition here in Colorado. And the caucus was split 2 years ago, 50-50.
So not all the Republicans agreed with Soper. Some voted for the Democratic speaker. Some voted for the minority leader. But this time around, for this session, Soper said Republicans in his caucus really didn't want to vote for a Democrat. They also didn't want to come across as a divided Republican caucus. So Soper went along with all the other Republicans and voted for the minority leader.
This year, what we saw was all the Democrats voted for Speaker McCluskey. All the Republicans voted for Minority Leader Pugliese to be Speaker. And, of course, McCluskey won. But that was very D.C.-like, and that's the full evolution of how you change tradition and custom. And so now the custom is probably unlikely to return back to how it was, which is kind of sad for me because I've always said Colorado's not like D.C. and we shouldn't be like D.C. Our electorate doesn't want us to be D.C.
I will say, though, in my experience so far, this is my 3rd session, is that Colorado isn't nearly as dysfunctional as Washington. But the House has gotten a little more contentious, and I think it's safe to say it does reflect more of the D.C.-style tensions and some of its dysfunction, maybe. It's a different story in the Senate, though. They did select the president by unanimous acclaim, which is a little different than what happened in the House. We're going to travel to the Senate in a moment to talk about what they got up to in the early days, when we come back from a quick break. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
You crave conversations about Colorado, the way it works, and the whys behind it. You get more of that in the Colorado Matters podcast.
How do you take a nuclear weapon from 1970 and make it modern?
If we're making decisions based on data, I would say the FDA is not following the data.
This is a homegrown film. This is a love letter to Colorado.
Find Colorado Matters every day, everywhere you get podcasts.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance. Like we've said in this episode, the big bill debates are still a little ways off, but one thing that does happen in the first part of the legislative session is we see a lot of bill introductions.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of bills.
Introduction of bills.
Senate Bill 1 by Senator Gonzalez and Representatives Bacon and Joseph concerning the administration of elections and in connection therewith creating the Colorado Voting Rights Act.
As you might be able to tell just from that first title, the Colorado Voting Rights Act, they are starting with some pretty big proposals.
Yeah, and I think it's worth pointing out just in both chambers, the first bill is something that the majority party puts forward to really put a lot of attention on, so it's pretty intentional. This is something we think is significant. Not that there won't be a lot of significant bills.
Right, they're trying to send a message, right?
Yes, definitely. And so the Colorado Voting Rights Act is certainly a way that Democrats say they want to get ahead of what Republicans and the conservative Supreme Court might do in Washington. And in this case, if the Voting Rights Act were entirely struck down or repealed by Congress.
And that goes back to what we talked about last episode about Democratic lawmakers really having Washington on their minds this session.
And I don't know about you, but I've heard that from a lot of Democrats that I've talked to just leading into the session and the first part of session.
A lot of them.
One member told me it was a dark cloud just hanging over everything. And it's just a juxtaposition with Democrats still doing well in Colorado, but not doing well federally in those elections and just really not knowing what could be coming our way.
Yeah, and Republicans are saying that Democrats are all doom and gloom over this and really shouldn't be predicting or expecting horrible things to happen. And they urge Democrats to take more of a wait-and-see approach instead of automatic resistance to Washington.
And as we're kind of still a little bit in a wait-and-see approach in terms of what happens with the new federal administration, that doesn't mean Democrats aren't pushing forward a lot of policies that we know will be pretty contentious.
Senate Bill 3 by Senators Sullivan and Gonzalez and Representatives Bosenecker and Froelich concerning prohibited activity involving semi-automatic firearms and in connection therewith prohibiting the manufacture, distribution, transfer, sale, and purchase of specified semi-automatic firearms and classifying a device that increases the rate of fire of a semi-automatic firearm as a dangerous weapon.
Okay, that was clearly a mouthful, but this is a bill, a gun control bill, that is definitely going to be a big deal this session. And basically, it would ban the sale of guns that can take detachable ammunition magazines.
And that covers a pretty wide range of weapons, including what a lot of people call assault rifles. And I will have to mention here that when we talked in our last episode, neither of us were expecting to see an assault weapons ban this session.
Yeah, we were told that it wasn't coming by some lawmakers.
Yeah, I mean, and this sounds like an assault weapons ban. So Democrats at least had told me that they just wanted to focus on enforcement of existing laws they'd passed in the gun space.
Of course, Democrats aren't saying this is a ban. They're saying it's about enforcing an existing law banning high-capacity magazines in Colorado. And after all this time, with this law already on the books, these magazines are still apparently easily available in Colorado. So now they're going after the guns that use the magazines.
Even if Democrats want to frame this as not an assault weapons ban, this would essentially ban a lot of assault weapons in the state.
That seems right. It seems like this would prevent people from selling and purchasing and Colorado manufacturing guns that have attachable magazines. And that's a lot of guns.
We've seen similar bills, although they were called assault weapon bans, the previous two sessions fail at the State House.
But there's one big difference from then to now, which is that this bill has a lot of Democrats signed on as sponsors.
I have a feeling this will be the topic of a future Purplish episode. I just have a little inkling.
Yeah, could be. Lawmakers aren't the only ones staking out an agenda right now.
Yeah, that's right. There's this other person in the building who may have a little sway.
Some influence.
Sits on the first floor, yeah. Governor Jared Polis gave his annual State of the State address in front of a joint legislative session, so it's all lawmakers and his cabinet and the mayor of Denver, just a lot of high-profile people. It's the most public time he has in the year to really outline his big priorities and his goals for the state and what he hopes lawmakers will work on over the next few months.
And to be clear, Polis can't force lawmakers to do anything, but he can definitely persuade. Like we said, he has a lot of influence as governor.
Yes, he definitely has leverage if he wants them to go in one direction or another.
This year, this was a pretty standard Polis speech. There were the run-of-the-mill pop culture references that he likes to include. There was no mention of Yoda, which was a little disappointing, I think.
I liked his Yoda impression that he did last year. I had some people who disagreed with me, but I thought he did a good job. But yes, no Yoda.
Anyway, back to policy. One of the things Polis really continued laying out this year in his speech is his vision of denser housing and more transit across the state.
Yes, and that's definitely a theme we've heard from him. And I think one thing that we always look out for is even though Democrats control the legislature and the governor's office, that doesn't mean they're always going to be in alignment, and that's to be expected. It's a large, diverse caucus and different political philosophies. And so one thing this address can do is give us some more transparency on what those areas of disagreement are going to be, especially in the next few weeks and months.
And one thing we came in expecting this year is a fight over the Labor Peace Act.
This is a Colorado law dating back to the 1940s that requires a second vote before workplaces could fully unionize. And workers' rights advocates say, look, it just makes it a lot harder to organize.
Colorado's actually the only state that has a law like this on the books. And there is a bit of a history with Governor Polis and workers' rights legislation. He vetoed 2 worker protections bills last year and has already signaled that he's pretty skeptical about this one.
That's right. I mean, during a State of the State address, a governor, including Polis, is not going to explicitly say, hey, I will veto this bill.
Right.
But he did issue a pretty strong warning.
My ask is that if there are any efforts to reform the Labor Peace Act, that they include the support of both workers and business to avoid the rancorous fights of the past.
So this sets an extremely high bar for any bill that he would sign, to have the business community in agreement with labor groups on something like this. I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's highly, highly unlikely. And that puts Polis at odds with some Democrats and what they see as a core value, which is pushing worker rights legislation.
And it's not the only tense issue we're going to see this year. We also heard from Democrats who were pretty mad about how Polis talked about immigration in his speech, specifically this moment.
To be clear, in Colorado, we have zero tolerance for those who commit crimes, whether they're American citizens or not. And I truly hope that President-elect Trump and Congress can work together quickly to secure the border, stop human trafficking, and stop the illegal flow of guns and drugs. And as a state, we welcome more federal help to detain and deport dangerous criminals.
I do want to add that Polis also said he doesn't want to break up families. He doesn't want to deport people who are contributing to society. He doesn't think immigrants should be living in the shadows. But some of his Democratic colleagues really felt like his rhetoric was too conservative sounding.
It's very disappointing when Democrats are repeating those harmful talking points from Republicans, that around strengthening the border and that migrants are criminals. We are community members and we are moms and daughters and family members that are working hard, having 2 to 3 jobs to pay for rent.
That was Democratic Representative Elizabeth Velasco. She's from Glenwood Springs, and she immigrated to the U.S. as a teenager from Mexico. And she's going to be working on a bill this session to strengthen protections for migrants and make it harder for the state to work with the federal government and immigration authorities.
And there's something that really highlights what Velasco said, and that's when the top Republican in the House, Rose Puglisi, really liked what Polis said and actually said it reflected what she said about immigration in her opening speech.
I know. She sent out a statement and was like, wow, he basically said what I did. I love that.
Yeah, I don't think that helped Polis's case with those in his own party that didn't respond well to what he said. But there was also another area where he sounded a bit Republican-ish, maybe purplish, and that's when he talked about cutting regulations. He directly called on the legislature and legislative leaders to work together and find government regulations that are unnecessary or overburdensome and cut them.
And of course, that's something we've heard from Republicans a lot over the years, and I've talked to some Democrats this session that say with the tight budget they're facing, they do need to go back and look at programs that maybe aren't as efficient or working as well. But this is one of those areas where I think the devils are really in the details of what substantive things do they come up with. It's kind of easy to say, like, hey, we should cut government red tape and streamline things. But what are they going to come up with that can pass?
And I think Republicans do, though, see this as a potential area of common ground with the governor. They're hopeful that he's going to follow through on these calls and that they can work with him on cutting some regulations, which, like you said, is something they've wanted to do for a long time. But at the same time, they're a little skeptical that the governor is willing to go as far as they want him to.
And I'm sure Republicans will have a lot of ideas that they will have highlighted for him to look at.
Of course, now the question is, how will all these ideas actually play out during the session? We've seen a lot of things coming our way, but we're going to have to see how they play out, and that should keep us busy for a lot more weeks of this podcast.
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Capital News Alliance.
The CNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets all over the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Lucas Brady Woods.
And I'm Benta Birkeland. This episode was edited by Megan Verlee and Joe Erickson and produced by Shane Rumsey.
We'll be back in your feeds every week all through the session. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Capital News Alliance.